Today, I'm delighted to welcome Angela Le Mathon, Vice President of People, Data and Analytics at GSK, to the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Angela, welcome to the show. I'm looking forward to our conversation. We've known each other, I think, must be for nearly 10 years now. Before we get started, can you give a brief introduction to you and your career journey to date?
Sure. My name is Angela. I've been in data and analytics more broadly for over 20 years, but specifically people data analytics for 10, which is where we met many years ago. I would say, gosh, looking across my career, there's probably three big buckets that I've been sort of privileged to participate in. One is the data and analytics component, which is kind of the sort of foundation. I would say the second piece of that is very much around AI risk and strategy. And that's just constantly emerged as the industry has progressed. And then I think the third bucket more recently has been around skills data and the expertise around skills data. And so my career over the 10 years in HR has largely framed around those areas. And I think it's been exciting. I'm really fascinated by the future of where AI is taking HR. And I'm just delighted to be on this journey.
Well, that's good. That's great. And as you said, you've been in the people analytics space for a decade. And I think when we first met, I think Barry Swales, who hosts People Analytics World, I think brought us together for a small talking shop, I think, before to help his agenda for, I think it may have been a 2016 or 2015 People Analytics World. When you reflect on the space, you talked about the three areas where you see people analytics develop, but maybe as a people analytics leader as well, how have you seen people analytics go up the people agenda over the last decade?
I think as more and more companies realize the importance of making really intelligent talent decisions and realizing the value of kind of people in the organization, right? So I think intellectually we know that a company is a collection of people, but the ability to have the insights required to manage a large workforce has been quite difficult. And so I think the importance of people analytics over the years has been a reflection of companies trying to make sense of all our people and trying to make the best decisions to help them thrive. And I think it's been tricky because you need a lot of data structured in a very particular way. It needs to be relevant. It needs to be timely. And so there's so many components of the way we have to think about people insights that I think companies have started to recognize it needs to be a more formal structure. We can't just rely on managers to do this. We can't make assumptions about people from a cost perspective, which is where I know some companies focus heavily on the financial aspects or reward constructs. You start to realize that you need a lot more nuance when you look at the workforce. And so I think people analytics is that space to offer that because it embodies scientific approaches, it embodies technology, but most importantly, it embodies sort of people and behavior. And I think that's kind of those three building blocks that are really important for companies today.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, again, like an increasing number of your peers, I think when we did the research at Insight 222 last year, just over 20% now, people analytics leaders, part of the HR leadership team, reporting directly into the CHRO as you do at GSK. Maybe how does that help you as a people analytics leader, being part of the HR leadership team rather than being one or two steps removed?
I think it's the ability to influence the agenda by showing and demonstrating how important people analytics really can be to decision making. I think traditional HR models and traditional mindsets about how to make talent decisions limits your ability to really be effective, right? And so I think by sitting at the table, you start to show all the ways in which you can drive better synergy, you can drive better integrations by leveraging data. I think the ability to look at talent programs that we're launching and be able to say, look, here's how data and analytics is going to transform the way we think about making talent decisions and how we think about even delivering talent. I think sitting at the table and looking at our learning programs and being able to say, here's the best way to upscale or rescale our workforce, because you're now talking about skills data in a very tangible way, in a very concrete way, rather than a very theoretical way. And so I think sitting at the table, you transform the conversation from not just data and insights, but data as a service, right? How do we actually provide a service through our data models? How do we think about data as a product? And so how do you productize a lot of the insights that we're generating into the business in a meaningful way? And so you really start to supercharge the function for the future. And you're doing it in a very cost efficient way because you're leveraging technology. And so you're not necessarily labor intensive. You're not exactly increasing headcount, but you're getting more value. And I think that combination is extremely attractive to businesses.
Well, that's a great. I think that's a great start to our conversation, Angela. I know we'll explore some of those themes a little bit deeper over the next 40 minutes or so. Now, at GSK, I know you're in the midst of a digital and data-driven HR transformation journey at the moment. What does that actually mean for GSK, and what does that mean for you and your role?
I think for GSK, I mean, we've been on quite a transformation. We had, one of the largest sort of demergers in our history back in 2022. HR as a function also transformed, so we decentralized many parts of our business. And I think people, data, and analytics, then as a function, sort of took a top seat at the table. And so I think specifically what that meant is, if I look at our sort of, our tagline or our purpose, it's uniting science, technology, and talent to get ahead of disease together. And so what that means specifically for us is that AI and skills becomes a really big opportunity for us to understand how we actually support talent decisions. And so I think when I look at my AI program and how I think about leveraging AI for HR, there's a few things that comes to mind. I think when you look at AI, there's no data, no AI. So that relationship needs to be intelligent. So we need to come together and partner to create a very effective AI, data, and tech strategy that allows us to look at four things, right? I think one is the master data management over our critical data assets. And that's really where you start to gain competitive advantage, right? So we've always known that you can't make intelligent decisions just looking at people data. You need to look at people data, business data, and multiple other data sets in a really smart way. So that's one. The second pillar is you then need an inventory of AI models that are both custom built or acquired. Many of the solutions that we're looking at today, different companies are adding on AI models in various components. We also have then those that we're building, and it's not always clear how they integrate with each other. And so therefore, we're not always seeing the benefit. Having a bit of a structured inventory around what that looks like becomes really important. So that's the second component. I think the third component is an investment in the right AI platforms and integrations. And so this is how we drive scale. I think many of the tech stacks that you're looking at and many of the integrations aren't always done with that sort of end goal in mind of driving value. And so we're really looking at how we actually rationalize our tech stack and how we make sure that we get the right integrations and the data flowing in the right place. So that's, I think, the third component. And then I think lastly, it's the creation of an AI layer in the appropriate way that gives you risk and control, right? That gives you the right governance. And I think this is where you start to realize the value. Because I think what I have seen from some of my peers is that a lot of wonderful AI solutions come on the table, but then there's all these derailers, right? There's all this regulation. You can't actually leverage it. And so you never really get the benefit because there's an ethical component that isn't easily explained, right? It's the black box syndrome. And you want to make sure that if you're putting AI models into sort of HR and supporting decision making, that you're more of a white box, that there's more transparency, there's more fairness. And so I think those are like the four pillars of how specifically at GSK we're thinking about AI, and we're using AI to really drive business value.
Yeah, and actually, we're going to talk a little bit about regulation later, because I think regulation could be a challenge in the short term, but arguably it enables us in the long term to be doing the right thing by our workforce as well, which is obviously important. You talked about having a well-defined data strategy, and I know that's a time that you spend quite a lot of time investing in that, and both in terms of time and effort and technologies at GSK. How does that help you through the transformation journey? Because I think you talked a little bit about having that master data management in place, and obviously if you're going to be solving business challenges with people analytics, it's not just about the people data, it's about bringing the other data together as well. Just be great to talk a little bit, maybe it's a two-pronged question. So maybe how is this helping you through that transformation journey? And then how did you set it up?
So I think quite early on, I think we recognized because GSK more broadly is looking at AI, we knew that that's one of the opportunities we wanted to explore. So we know that AI became the space we really wanted to drive value. I think the second thing we then realized is skills became another opportunity for us, right? So how do we build skills for the future? Because we wanted an agile workforce. And so with those two components, I understood quite quickly that having a really strong data foundation would be critical for our ability to test and learn. So the beauty and the challenge of both those areas is that everyone's talking about AI, everyone's talking about skills. Getting the ROI is the tricky part, right? Being able to evidence the value. And so the foundation has now been established for us to test and learn, for us to really explore how AI and skills are really going to drive value for GSK. I don't think it has to be every process, and I don't think it has to be every part of our business, but there are critical areas where we know these are going to drive value. And so the foundation that we've now established helps us to test and learn really cheaply, cost effectively. And I think it sets us up, in such a competitive way. And this is kind of what my focus has been, I would say, for the first sort of like year in my role, was getting up just a strong foundation for us to build off of.
And it's interesting because it's, we speak to a lot of your peers in other organizations, and particularly HR leaders as well. And there's this big desire to do stuff around AI. But there's not always a business reason for doing it. And I think what you've landed on there is, for GSK's business, the transformation that you're on as an organization, and some of the other business dynamics affecting your industry, is skills becomes very important. So skills is the business driver that's helping you land some of that work that you're doing around AI and the investment that you're making in your data to do that. And I don't know if you could talk to that, about how important that is to, I think in people analytics, sometimes we want to do cool stuff, whether it's with AI or whether it's with network analytics or other things, but we've got to link it to the business, haven't we?
Exactly. I mean, I think, for us, we always sort of really make sure that we can break down the business strategies in a very specific way, and then work backwards to say, okay, if the business is trying to achieve a particular thing, how do we support that? So, for example, if there are certain critical skill sets that we know are really important to our sales organization, how do we support the business's ability to, define them through data, identify those skill sets in the workforce, but then also identify gaps in that workforce so that we can then make those decisions around upskilling, reskilling, or potentially going external for talent, right? That visibility becomes quite important. It's not always the sexiest of subjects, because delivering that requires a lot of different moving parts. But this is kind of the way that we always think about making sure that there's business value at the end of the conversation. So we start with the business strategy, the business need. We then work backwards to, okay, what would it take to solve that? Can we solve that? Do we have the elements in place to deliver that? And then once we sort of understand that delta, we then work towards a sort of a pathway forward that says, here's how we support the business. So that's critical to how we do this, because the investment required really needs to be driven by the business. Their buy-in is essential.
Yeah. And again, maybe back to our earlier conversation, in terms of actually getting the support both within HR and probably from other parts of the business. How did being part of the HR leadership team help you to secure this investment? And secondly, who are some of the other stakeholders that you had to involve in the business to kind of, first of all, diagnose the problem, and then come up with the solution that you needed to do to answer those challenges, I guess?
So I think there's a couple parts. I think sitting at the table means that I'm always in a position to bring that sort of data lens to a conversation. And so what my boss loves to say is that I'm a delightful irritant. Because I am always the person that sort of has a different approach or a different lens to how we can tackle something. And so I think that's step one, right? Is, if you're going to sit at the table and you are embodying a skill set that is new, that is different, but also that is, a disruptor in many ways, because that's what, let's face it, AI, Gen AI, these are disruptors. You have to be comfortable leaning in. You have to become comfortable almost challenging the status quo in a different mindset. So I think step one is being able to do that. I think then step two is rapid prototyping. So it's great to sort of, be an agitator in the room, but then second, it's being able to quickly demonstrate this other way of thinking, this other approach. And so I think what I've done successfully is be able to translate that in a concrete way that says, here's another way we can use data analytics to solve a particular challenge. So for example, when we were having discussions around career opportunities, the discussion was very much around employee experience. And the discussion was very much around what's the platform for employees to experience. And then I came and said, I think it's deeper than experience. I think what we really need to understand is skills. We need to understand what are the skills people are looking for through the experience. What are the skills that people are engaging with through those experiences? So it was really trying to understand there's a data component to that. If we can isolate for that, then there's a much bigger story and opportunity that presents itself. And so being willing to challenge, even when the room is looking at you, kind of saying, what does she mean? And what is she referring to? It's not easy. You don't always want to be the change agent at the table. It's not a safe way of working. But I think if you do it in the right way, then you do help bring the sort of leadership team along and you bring them with you. And I think that's the journey that I've been able to be successful at so far. And so, yeah, let's see where it goes.
No, it's certainly. I mean, I know you're doing some excellent work there. Again, thinking back to the data strategy piece as well. What were some of the challenges that you faced during the implementation, and how did you overcome them?
I think so. When I really started the journey, I think it was a combination of getting people to understand the opportunity and the size of the opportunity. So there was an education around AI, data, and technology as sort of an integrated subject. And the idea that the strategies have to align, I think that was a big challenge. So it was getting our partnership with technology into a good place, because I think there was a different way we manage our relationship with tech. There was a very disparate way in which we thought about sort of our tech stack. And so I think step one was getting people to see that. So it was partnering heavily with technology. I think was also my engagement with risk, because I think it was making sure that the risk teams understood that this is a smart way to integrate data. And so when we think about some of the data solutions that we built, and how we leveraged it, it was very much getting them comfortable that all these different data sets coming together was sort of being integrated in an intelligent way. And then I think thirdly, it was getting the business comfortable with these different scientific methods and methodologies. So when you're taking people data and you're doing more than analyzing it in very basic ways, you're actually applying various scientific methods and approaches to the data. The business can be sometimes a bit like, wait a second, what is this methodology? What are you showing me? This looks too complicated. But when they start to realize the value on the other side of the conversation, and that these methodologies are proven, tested, that there's a logic to it, it builds enormous trust. And so I think the challenge has really been bringing people along the journey, because it sounds really complicated when you describe it. It sounds like it's a big undertaking and it gets intimidating, and you think, oh my gosh, I don't know if we have time for this. Just get me my report, right? But when you then evidence the value of the questions you're trying to answer, right? They can't be done in the traditional methods. You do have to step your game up a little bit and apply a bit more rigor and structure. When people start to see the value, hence the rapid prototyping, there's like a declick that happens, and people suddenly realize like, oh, this is the way forward. And so that's kind of the challenge of it, is many moving parts, many moving components, not always well understood. But once you can evidence that in a very meaningful way, then you get the buy-in, and then you get the excitement that follows.
And I think listening to you there, Angela, I think you highlighted two really important points. First of all, with diagnosing, do proper problem diagnosis of the problem you're trying to solve. That's a bit of a mouthful way I explain that. Proper problem diagnosis. There we are. And then secondly is getting the stakeholders lined up. And then the third thing is good consulting skills to really get to that as well. It's all very important. And then the last bit, which I think is underappreciated sometimes, but you've definitely highlighted the importance of, is change management. This is a different way of doing things, but it helps you get to the right answer probably more often and quicker potentially.
Absolutely. I mean, I think change management is the thing that's probably overlooked, because it's almost a given that you've done the hard work, and so the value will just sort of appear. But in my world, you have to actually be quite methodological.
You've called it from me now.
I've caught it for you now. Yeah. Methodological in terms of how you approach change. And so for us, it's the same thing, right? We take a very scientific approach to change management. We follow a model, which is, called a COM-B model, if you will. We look at sort of the capability, or what is the ability of people to actually want to change their behavior or to act on the change. We get very intentional about what the opportunity for change looks like. So that's the environment, and do people feel like they're enabled to actually behave in another way? And then we look at the motivation of people to actually sort of, what's the drive, what's the carrot, as we like to say internally. And I think because we take such a scientific approach to change management when it comes to how we think about upskilling or reskilling or supporting decision making, it helps us then to understand a bit of the sort of fuel friction dynamic of how people think about choice. And so that helps us understand, what's the barrier, right? Like what's the constraint, what's the blocker when it comes to someone's ability to choose versus the motivator and the driver around those choices. And so I think always applying that scientific lens just ensures that there's a confidence and there's sort of a way forward when there's potentially chaos in the room and people feeling a bit anxious and, oh my gosh, what are you guys doing? This is where the confidence comes in. This is where the buy-in comes in, because there is a way forward and there is a structure and it's not chaos. Even if it's different, it's not chaotic. And so I think this is something that we take quite seriously, and that I think it's been super helpful because of all the moving parts that we're experiencing at GSK with all the change. So
now, earlier, Angela, you alluded to the importance of scaling. So we've been conducting our Insight 222 People Analytics Trends research now for 4 years. We're actually in the 5th year at the moment. And last year we identified 8 characteristics of companies that are leading with people analytics. These are the companies that are creating value on a sustainable basis. And it's about two areas really of 4 characteristics each. One is around investment, and you've talked a little bit around that, business prioritization, getting the right skills in the team. And then the second one is around scaling, and you talked around that. And one of the areas that we see companies scaling is by democratizing insights out to managers in the business. And you talked about one of the ways that companies typically do that was with their technology stack. So I know you're partnering with Vizia at GSK as your people analytics technology partner. How has that collaboration, first of all, allowed you to scale, but also how has it influenced your HR transformation efforts as well?
yeah, I mean, I think Vizier is a very powerful insights tool, and so it's allowed us to look at our people data in a very different way. And I think this has been really helpful to get people comfortable with people insights. I think when you consider that a lot of the function was, and sometimes is, in a very sort of manual spreadsheet type of hell where they're trying to do all these things themselves because they're trying to make sense of a lot of data, it gets difficult, right? When you're trying to stitch together yourself a lot of different data sources, it's time consuming, it's labor intensive, and it tends to be almost outdated by the time you get to an answer. And so I think what Vizier's allowed us to do is, in a very sort of timely way, consolidate a lot of different sources of data and visualize it in a really intelligent way for us to kind of, in a timely fashion, get to the heart of the matter, see a trend, see movement in the data, and be able to react. And so we spend more time investigating as opposed to curating. And I think that step change is where the value comes in. So Vizier has been critical on our change journey when it comes to how we become more data driven and how we make more sort of data driven decisions about talent within our function.
And I know you talked about AI earlier, and obviously when we go, like me, you go along to one of these technology conferences, every vendor's talking about how they've built AI into their tools. But actually, in the area of the kind of people data platforms, I think some of those companies, and Vizia is one of those, has actually embedded AI into what they're doing. So I think with Vizia, their AI tool is V. I don't know how that's supported as well. I don't know, because you talked about getting AI out into the field. Has that helped at all?
So we're in the early days of testing V. I think there's pluses and minuses. I think V, because it's relying on some of the technology from sort of Microsoft. I think you get into that black box territory a little bit. So though it's through the platform, there's some things that we're still trying to figure out. So I think V is one of those test and learn scenarios. But I think separately from Vizier, my team has also built our own custom LLM in HR. And so I think because we've built it and we've designed it, it's helped us to make sense of our data. And so what we've done is, within our annual surveys, we get a lot of verbatim comments from our workforce. And so the traditional methods that we've applied to try to make sense of that was quite time consuming and difficult. And so we've then leveraged the LLM model to help us rationalize it in a really smart way. And so we built this tool called we built a tool called Spotlight. And Spotlight enables us to actually make sense of our verbatims, to actually uncover insights that people are trying to share in a way that we haven't before. And I think that's been a massive unlock for us, because it's helped us understand that there's different ways that employees express challenges or concerns. And so we've been able to actually get into a bit more detail. So I think though the tool that Visier V is offering us is good and it's interesting, because we've acquired that solution, we're still very much testing and learning it. I think the difference is our custom sort of in-house solution has been where we've seen a bit more value, because we've understood it, we've built it, and so therefore from a decision-making perspective, we're slightly more comfortable leveraging that. There's more of an ethical component. I think what's still difficult sometimes with some of the solutions that we acquire is we're still trying to understand where it's coming from, how it's getting to those conclusions. There's still quite a lot of fact checking that goes with it. So that's kind of the dynamic that we're in a little bit with some of those technologies.
Yeah, it's such an important point, because I mean, we're only by the time this episode goes out, we're less than 2 years into the generative AI journey, really. And as you said, it's so important that although these tools are appearing all the time, as organizations, particularly with regards to people data, as you said, they're so important that we test and we learn that these are powerful tools, that we kick the tires on it effectively, and we make sure that not only is it delivering value, but it's delivering value the right way. So it's really interesting. And I think the other area there, which is very, very interesting, is that everyone talks about build versus buy, but I think in reality it's a bit of both with most of the people analytics teams that we're working with. And that's a great example. It's a great example of where to apply large language models is in all these text comments we get in our surveys, because for so many years, companies haven't been able to do that much with that, but you can get some really deep insight on that, and actually listening to our employees at a much deeper level, and then drive the change and the ideas sometimes that they're actually putting in, taking the time to put in those comments. So I think that's a really good example there, Angela. And one of the other 8 characteristics in the Insight 222 leading companies, our people analytics trends, is this piece around creating a data-driven culture. So that's partly through role modeling by the CHRO and the HR leadership team, but it's also by inspiring and upskilling HR professionals. And that's definitely part of, digitizing HR, as it were. At GSK, how are you approaching upskilling and reskilling your HR function?
So I think we take a very hands-on approach to upskilling, reskilling, specifically when it comes to people insights. So we do quite a lot of trainings. I have a training with my leadership team next week for 2 hours, where I'm taking them through quite a lot of our insight tools and kind of evidencing and demonstrating how they leverage it. They're very hands-on in those kind of sessions. We run sprints and we have different sort of quizzes and games. So we actively sort of bring it to life. My team individually does a lot of kind of, lunch and learn sessions. They'll join various leadership teams and they cover various components of our sort of product catalog. So within the HR function, we have the privilege of being quite hands-on. And we focus heavily on almost upskilling champions, if you will, or change champions that are then in a better position to go out into the businesses and then sort of diffuse that. So my team being about only 27 people, we can't sort of, train the whole organization. But by focusing our energy on sort of, the key HR professionals that are most positioned to then drive that through to the business is really where we drive the value. So we take a very, very, very hands-on approach, and we make sure everyone's comfortable, that they understand sort of what the products are, what the insights are. We make it very clear certain solutions offer certain things. So, we make it easier to say, tool X helps you solve problem Y. And so we explain that relationship and we explain the limitation. So we actively are communicating and explaining, because I think some of the noise with AI is the assumption that they all the tools can do everything, right? So if someone's in Copilot, well, can I just do it in Copilot? Do I need to go to Vizier? And so almost educating and explain the differences of how those two solutions work together. And so that's a lot of how we support HR is a lot of education piece.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting actually. So some of the other research that we've done at Insight 222, two of the kind of four things that we found from companies that are doing this well. Number one, there's role modeling by the HR leadership team. So the fact that you're spending time with the HR leadership team to upskill them so that they can role model it to other HR professionals is great, because you said it helps scale what you and your team can do on their own. And then the second element that we found, and this isn't always too popular with people analytics leaders, is that we found that actually where the upskilling effort is driven by the people analytics leader and their team, albeit with the support of the learning team, for example, then HR professionals are much more likely to invest the time in doing that upskilling, and B, likely to benefit from it as well. So I think the fact that you're doing those two steps is really interesting. And we're working with a number of HR leadership teams at the moment to upskill them around people data literacy and AI and other areas. And I think what's so great is that HR leaders themselves in many organizations, and obviously the cases at GSK, recognize that they need upskilling. And I think that's really healthy for our function, because our function is changing quite dramatically. We are moving from a traditional role as a support function to being a real strategic partner to the business, and that requires different skills. So I think the fact that obviously you and the team at GSK are investing in that, Angela, I think is great, and I think it augurs well for your journey to continue moving forward. Again, one of the other areas in the 8 characteristics is around ethics, and I think this particularly is particularly important when we're talking about AI. It's critical to build that trust through the responsible use of these technologies, not just from an ethical, but also from a regulatory perspective as well. We've got increasing regulation coming in around governing the use of AI tools, both for consumers, but also for employees as well. We're in the implementation phase of the European Union's AI Act at the moment. What sort of governance have you put in place at GSK to ensure the ethical use of AI in with regards to people data?
I would say, luckily for us, because AI is a business sort of imperative, there's almost an enterprise accountability for how we think about AI. And so we have a central governance body that sets out guidelines for the ethical use of AI in each part of the business. So there's that kind of broader wrapper. Specifically in my team, I've just actually hired an actual AI risk manager. And their primary accountability is to ensure the responsible use of AI models in our data products. So there's an individual who's going to be looking at that accountability. And then I think also supporting us when we think about, the AI solutions that might be available within different parts of our tech stack, really being methodological about what data is required to make the solutions work. How are those models actually built? And so that's where you get into the bias testing, you conduct risk reviews, you establish metrics and controls around all of those components to just make sure that before we turn something on, that we understand it. And so I think we take a very sort of, I would say, joined up approach between sort of the overall frame that the enterprise offers, as well as in-house, making sure that we've got someone who's accountable to actually look at the ethical use of AI within how we run ourselves within PDA, People Data Analytics, which is my team, but also more broadly in terms of how that's diffused throughout the organization.
No, it's really good, and yeah, I think that's a really great tip for anyone listening. It's likely, highly likely, that your organization is looking at this from an enterprise level, looking at governance of using AI, in various areas, including within HR. So I think that's great. Piggyback on that, work with those teams, make sure there's some consistency, of course, and it probably solves 60 to 70% of the work for you as well in doing that. And it's much easier to get sign off because it's obviously something that's been done at an enterprise level already. And really interesting that you've actually hired an AI risk manager into your team, and that's potentially their role to look at the responsible use of AI. I think we'll start seeing that in more people analytics teams as we move forward as well. I think it's really really good to see that. Angela, before we get to the question of the series, which is the question that we're asking everyone in this series of the podcast, really interested. You mentioned your team at GSK is around 25 people. I know that one of the questions our listeners always want me to ask is how is that team structured? How, what are some of the main teams sub teams within your team, and what are some of the key roles within there as well?
Sure. The way I've set up my function is I've got 4 verticals, and so the first vertical is data governance and platforms, and so that's really where the metadata management comes in, right? How we think about managing our data, and so they oversee our data lake, and they oversee kind of the foundational components of our data solutions. The second vertical I have is digital products. And that's effectively where we then visualize a lot of our data. So, the management of Visier, the management of our Spotlight, our in-house tool, the management of our Power BI platforms, any sort of visualization tooling or digital product is managed by that second vertical. The third vertical is data science. So that's the AI ML part of that. And so they're very much looking at trying to make sense of data insights in a way that is not easily recognized by the naked eye. Is how they like to sort of brand it. And so that's the sort of third bucket. And then my fourth bucket is my employee listening and behavior change. And so that's where we get into more of the qualitative aspects of how do we make sense of people data, but from a behavioral component, because at the end of the day, we're talking about making decisions about people, right? About talent. And so how those decisions will play out in the organization becomes really, really important. And so those are the 4 areas that I've kind of established. And all of those 4 areas have a very sort of methodological, have a very scientific approach to how they run themselves.
Yeah. Sorry, you do definitely call the bug for me. I'm always tripping over my words, but no, that's really interesting actually, and I think you highlighted another really important element there, the whole behavioural change piece, because a lot of the time the insights that we find in people analytics, they only really land if people change their behaviours, and obviously, so the insight's important, the way you present the insight's important, and the way you measure the impact is so good as well. So yeah, I love that's really helpful that the team's structured like that. I think it's good to hear, and I know our listeners always like to, particularly your peers in other people analytics leaders, love to hear that. So Angela, we've come towards the end of our conversation now already. It's happened really quickly, but so this is again the question of the series. So this is the question we're asking all the guests in this series of the Digital HR Leaders podcast, and this might give you an opportunity to summarize as well some of the things that you've talked about. How can workforce analytics enhance HR decision making and drive business success?
I think workforce analytics can enhance HR decision making and drive business success. I think if you build trust in the data first, I think that's critical. I think you won't get the business to even look at the data, let alone make a decision off of it if they don't trust it. So I think building trust in the data becomes critical, and I think for me that's translated into the sort of scientific approach that we apply, right? So it's all about the science. I work at a life sciences company, so that was a natural sort of synergy. And I think science is the best way to sort of provide the objective frame for data analysis and insights. And so that's where decision science, data science, behavior science, or actuarial science comes in, is that we always strive to provide the latest thinking, the latest methodologies for how we make sense of our data, with a lens that the goal is to support how our people thrive. And so I believe that this approach has been the thing that's been the most effective to supporting the businesses sort of trust and kind of what we deliver, and helping them make the best talent decisions for the organization.
Very good. And I know we probably could talk for ages, Angela, about the skills journey you're on as well, but maybe we'll have to do that another time. Maybe there's one area, and I don't know if you could, so I know again this is a topic that everyone's very interested in. When it comes to skills, what are some of the successes that you've had with this? Because again, it's a bit like AI in some respects. There's a lot of hype around it, and I think a lot of organizations struggling if they're making the shift to the skills-based organization. Maybe one or two things that you've done that have really landed well with the business.
I think one, it's we built out a skills data infrastructure, And we did that in about 6 months. And I know a lot of companies, this takes close to 5 years to build, right? And so I think we did it in a very sort of cost-effective manner by leveraging AI technologies, by leveraging some of our internal critical data assets. So that's created a bit of a competitive advantage for us, and that we have a solid foundation. And I think in doing that, we're now in a position to test and learn in different components. And so I think, we're not making the bold claim of being skill-based. We want to really understand, now that we've got a richness of a bit of a skills engine at play, how do we now start to test different use cases to drive value? And so I think that's the part that that's the journey that we're on now, is that we're being very pragmatic. So we've got the data, it's given us some initial insights. And so there's been a couple aha moments just with that foundation in place. And now we want to look at testing and learning. And so I think for me, that's probably been the area of competitive advantage, because we didn't go all out with various solutions of, we're over promising things. We're partnering with the business to say, look, we've done some foundational work. And so we've got a good way in which we can look at skills. We've got a strong engine. Let's partner together and actually identify use cases and solve for that in a very intelligent way. And I think that partnership of it not being HR trying to do everything on its own and then pushing it on the business, the fact that we've said, well, we've got this foundation, come in and work with us. I think that partnership is what's making it quite exciting, because we're holding hands together while we solve for specific skills challenges in the company. And I think there's also recognition that skills building isn't an option, right? So everyone may do it differently, but we all have to agree that is an area of focus. And so I think that's the pragmatic way in which we've been able to approach that.
No, that's really, really good, Angela. And I think for people that are leading people analytics teams that are maybe early in their journey than you are at GSK, and frankly, some that are probably similar level of maturity, I think what's really shone through in our discussion is, you take a scientific approach, and the efforts really focused on areas that are important to the business, and you do proper problem diagnosis. But it's this test and learn. It's like, okay, let's do something, let's see if it has an impact, let's learn from it, and let's move it forward. And I guess that creates momentum then that you can then use to invest more in some of these areas where you are getting some wins. So really impressive work, Angela. And thank you so much for being a guest on the Digital HR Leaders podcast and sharing some of the work that you're doing at GSK with listeners. I know that they would have gained a lot from today. And lastly, how do people stay in touch with you and find out more about what you and the team are doing at GSK?
Well, David, I'd say thanks to you and the wonderful community that you've created on LinkedIn. I'd say people can find me there as well. I am known to comment on a few of your posts, and I'm quite active when I can be in various sort of forums. So I'd say anyone interested in getting in contact with me, understanding a bit more what we're doing at GSK, and just having a discussion more broadly about people analytics, AI, or skills, reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to have a chat.
Well, Angela, thank you very much, and thank you for everything you do for the field as well.
Thank you.
So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you. I'm sure I will see you in person very soon.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. Thanks, David.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.